All right, let's dive right into this. Imagine, just for a second, one of the most famous pieces of 19th century French literature. We're talking a legendary, slow burn story of betrayal, ultimate patience, and incredibly meticulous revenge. Okay, you have it in your head. Now, imagine taking that exact same story, ripping it entirely out of historic Europe, and just chucking it into a totally surreal, futuristic sci-fi universe. A universe packed with spaceships, blue-skinned vampires, and giant mechas. I mean, it sounds completely unhinged, right? But hey, that is literally exactly what the anime Gankutsuou did with Alexander Dumas' classic novel, The Count of Monte Cristo. In this explainer, we're going to unpack how this wildly bold adaptation actually works, where it goes completely off the rails from the source material, and why it ended up dividing audiences so fiercely. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll look at the massive jump to the year 5053. Then, we'll check out the show's totally experimental visual style, break down the crazy narrative shift in perspective, look at the Count's bizarre sci-fi makeover, and finally, weigh the deeply polarized community reception to see if this whole thing was a masterpiece or a total miss. But honestly, before we get too deep into this serious literary analysis of it all, we really need to set the stage for the wonderfully weird tone we're dealing with here. To give you an idea, a user on a Reddit thread described their viewing experience like this. 85% of the suspense hinged on what space groomer Willy Wonka chose to do. And honestly, they hit the nail right on the head. That is an incredibly accurate hook, and it just perfectly captures the eccentric, super unorthodox vibe of the entire series. Okay, let's jump straight into Section 1, Dumas in Year 5053. Welcome to the future. The sheer visual whiplash here is just wild. On one hand, you have Dumas' original setting, right? 19th century France. We're talking classic sailing ships, horse-drawn carriages, and historic high society. But then Gankutsuou just drops us straight into the year 5053. The story actually kicks off during a massive carnival festival on the moon city of Luna. So instead of carriages, boom, we've got spaceships. Instead of those traditional elegant sword fights, clunky CGI mecha duels. But the craziest part is that it still keeps the whole vibe of 19th century aristocratic life. The high society still acts exactly like historic French nobility. It's this bizarre but totally captivating genre mashup. Like one viewer hilariously pointed out, hearing a character drop a line like, "When I was thrown out of the Chateau d'If into space," well, it's just never not going to be funny. And you know, that crazy futuristic setting goes perfectly with our next point. Section 2, a visual texture revolution. Look, if you have seen even a single solitary frame of the show, you already know it looks like absolutely nothing else out there. The big secret here is something called the unmoving plaid technique. So instead of coloring the character's clothing and hair the normal way, the animators use these static digital textures and really vivid patterns. And here's the kicker. As the characters move around the screen, those textures just stay completely still in the background, matted over their silhouettes. It's almost like a green screen effect on their clothes. It gives all these aristocrats this incredibly opulent, kind of dreamy, and, let's be real, sometimes totally dizzying look. A completely staggering amount of effort went into building this world. They actually brought in the renowned fashion designer Anna Sue to handle the character costumes, which completely explains those high-fashion, gaudy textures. The soundtrack, that was done by Jean-Jacques Brunel. And the environments are heavily inspired by the Art Nouveau movement, so you get all these cavernous, flowing shapes everywhere. They were also attempting this super experimental blend of 2D traditional art with 3D CG elements. Now, while those 2D textures are pretty much universally praised as this incredible effect, the early 2000s 3D CGI, yeah, especially those mechas, fans frequently call those out as a bit of an eyesore. It's a classic case of a show whose ambition maybe ran just a little bit ahead of the technology they had at the time. So we've got a wild new setting and a totally radical look. But what about the actual story? Let's move into Section 3, shifting the perspective. Now, this is arguably the single most controversial and honestly, maybe the most brilliant narrative leap the creators took. In the original novel, you're riding along with Edmond Dantes, the Count, watching him get betrayed, escape prison, and just meticulously tear apart his enemies' lives. But Gankutsuou asks a massive structural question. What happens if we totally change the main character? The anime abandons the Count's point of view entirely. Instead, we follow Albert de Morcerf, this incredibly naive 15-year-old kid who just so happens to be the son of one of the very men who betrayed the Count.
When you put the two side by side, the impact of this choice is just huge. You've got the Count, deeply vengeful, steeped in a really tragic past, and the ultimate architect of destruction. And then you have Albert, completely naive, incredibly trusting, just out there looking for adventure and love. He is, tragically, the collateral damage. By putting the spotlight on innocents like Albert and his friends' friends and Eugenie, the anime totally reframes the entire narrative. You're no longer just sitting there cheering for this mastermind's brilliant revenge plot. Instead, you're actively watching young, innocent lives get indiscriminately shredded by his schemes. It really exposes the ugly, toxic side of retribution. Because we're in Albert's shoes, realizing his dad's treachery, and his cool new friend, the Count's absolute cruelty, it just hits with a completely different kind of emotional gut punch. It shows how just changing the lens through which a story is told can completely reinvent its message.
But of course, shifting that perspective meant they had to make some pretty wild changes to the title character himself. Let's look at Section 4, the vampiric space Count. So the Count gets a full-on, gothic, sci-fi makeover. He is depicted as this vampiric, blue-skinned aristocrat who is literally possessed by a demonic entity. In this version, while he was rotting away in the space prison of Chateau d'If, he didn't just meet some wise old abbé who taught him things. Nope, he made a dark pact with a mystical entity known as Gankutsuou. And this thing feeds directly off his hatred and his need for vengeance. It's a really cool, literal visualization of a major theme. A man completely hollowed out by revenge, his entire life force traded in for pure, consuming darkness. And doing this dramatically changes the timeline. Think about the 19th century novel. We spend a massive chunk of time on Edmund's initial betrayal, his brutal years in prison, his daring escape, and finding the treasure. All of that happens way before the actual revenge even starts. Well, the anime aggressively condenses all of that. The revenge plot just kicks off immediately, right in episode 1 on Luna. All that pre-Count backstory reduced to a few brief flashbacks. And the true origins of his demonic pact are kept totally secret until right near the climax. Now, if you're going in blind, this turns the whole anime into a really gripping mystery. But if you're a diehard fan of the original book, well, a lot of them found this super frustrating because it stripped out a lot of the nuance and character building that made the original Edmond Dantes so relatable. Which leads us perfectly into our final segment, Section 5, Masterpiece or Missed Opportunity. Let's break down how the anime community actually reacted to this hugely ambitious, definitely flawed, but totally unique adaptation. On one side of the aisle, you have some seriously glowing praise. One fan actually stated, without a doubt, Anime of the Year 2004, a beautifully reinterpreted classic novel. People in this camp absolutely love the tight plotting, the strong emotional core found in Albert's friendships, and of course those breathtaking experimental aesthetics. For them, taking a dusty, well-known story and turning it into a surreal thriller is exactly the kind of genre-bending bliss that makes this medium so incredible. But flip the coin, and the critiques are pretty brutal. Another viewer literally called it a spit in the face to the original. The science fiction elements are incoherent and only detract from the story. These critics are quick to point out the visually jarring 3D mechas, the weird plot holes that pop up when you alter the Count's motivations into a literal demonic possession, and an ending that steers way off course from the deeply satisfying conclusion of Dumas's original text. And yet, despite these deeply polarized views, the numbers really speak for themselves. The show holds a super impressive score of 8.28 out of 10 on my anime list. To put that into perspective, holding a score that high proves that even with its undeniable flaws, janky mecha battles, and controversial narrative shifts, Gankutsuou remains a uniquely beloved thriller. It just goes to show that a really strong central theme, revenge and its terrible consequences, can shine through even the most bizarre artistic choices. So what do you think? Are you brave enough to step into the year 5053, navigate those dazzling, unmoving plaids, and judge this radical adaptation for yourself? Whether you end up seeing it as an imaginative masterpiece or just a completely chaotic fever dream, one thing is for sure. There is absolutely nothing else out there quite like Gankutsuou. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive for today's explainer. Stay curious, keep exploring, and I'll catch you next time.